Tonight, we step into a world the Tudor dynasty never wanted you to see. Not the glittering throne or the dazzling feasts, but the silent chambers where secrets were whispered behind silk sleeves, and where the women closest to the queens carried truths powerful enough to shake an entire kingdom. They were the ladies-in-waiting, silk-drowned figures, silent witnesses to forbidden love, to betrayal, to letters hidden beneath pillows, and to the final tears shed before a queen walked toward the scaffold. They were the ones who saw Anne Boleyn kneel and pray through the night, who heard Catherine Howard scream in desperation down the corridors of Hampton Court, and who hid the most dangerous secret of Elizabeth I. A secret that, if revealed, could have brought the entire throne crashing down. And even after seeing everything, they spoke not a word, because in the Tudor court, knowing the truth was far more dangerous than any lie. Tonight, we open the final door to hear what they witnessed, what they heard, and what they carried with them to the grave. And here is something official Tudor history will never dare to admit. Inside those marble halls and shadows, the ladies-in-waiting were always the first to sense when danger began to shift. They saw it in the way a guard lingered just a little too long outside a door, in the unnatural silence of a corridor that was usually full of noise. In a letter quietly delivered at midnight, they recognized the warning signs, small tremors no one else would ever notice, yet enough to tell them that a storm was forming behind the throne. They heard arguments strangled behind crimson velvet curtains, whispers that died the moment footsteps approached, and names spoken with fear rather than reverence. And some mornings a familiar face simply vanished. The bed empty, the chest gone, only a small hairpin left on the cold stone floor, like an unmarked grave for a woman who had known too much. In the Tudor world, survival did not belong to the loyal or the brave, but to the silent. Those ladies learned to bury the truth so deeply that even they sometimes feared remembering it, because a single wrong breath, a wrong glance, a misplaced word could cost them their entire lives. So before we step further into these corridors, prepare yourself. What you're about to hear has never been spoken in the light. These are secrets whispered once, then smothered under centuries of dust and fear. And tonight, they return. In the silence, in the darkness, in the place where the Tudor dynasty hid their most dangerous ghosts. They say Anne Boleyn's death began with her eyes that could make the strongest men in the kingdom hesitate, and the same eyes that made the entire Tudor court tremble because of what they could see through. But before the sword from Calais was brought to London, before Anne was imprisoned in the White Tower, before the accusations of adultery were shouted in that humiliating trial, there was always one silent group who witnessed everything, her ladies-in-waiting. And the story does not begin on Tower Green. It begins in the small, quiet chambers where Anne's deepest secrets were whispered in the darkest hours of night. The ladies who once served Catherine of Aragon all remembered the moment their world began to shift. It was when a young woman returned from France, not conventionally beautiful, but sharp, graceful, and dangerous in a way they had never seen. Anne entered court like a spark falling onto dry hay, and the entire atmosphere of Whitehall changed from the very first night she was invited to a feast. One lady-in-waiting later recounted, always in fear, that no one had ever commanded the king's attention like that. Henry VIII was used to soft voices and lowered eyes, but Anne looked straight at him, so directly that those standing nearby felt chills run down their spine. But what very few understood was this. From that moment, Anne's ladies sensed two things at once, a brilliant future and a destiny already sealed. Anne Boleyn carried a confidence as sharp as a blade, but in the quiet nights, when her ladies helped her change into her nightgown, they were the only ones who saw her other face. She was afraid. She was doubtful. She understood with brutal clarity that the more the king adored her, the more the court despised her. And every night, as the ladies brushed her hair, they heard the questions she never dared speak aloud outside those walls. Do they want me dead? What is Cromwell doing behind my back? If I cannot give him a son, what will become of me? These were not signs of weakness. They were prophecy, an intuition the ladies shared but never admitted. One of the first secrets they ever buried was what truly happened the night Anne miscarried in 1536. History records that the lost child was a boy, the last fragile hope Anne had to secure her place. But what history records is never exactly what occurred. One lady said that before Anne collapsed beside her bed, she had seen a letter delivered to her. Henry's letter, or so it appeared, except the handwriting was not the king's. It was Cromwell's. The contents were never revealed, but after reading it, Anne clenched the page so tightly she tore it, and only hours later, the pain began. The ladies were forced to swear silence, but all of them knew the child did not die from nature alone. And from that moment on, they understood. Anne would never be safe again. Henry visited her chamber that same day, and the ladies stood at the corner, eyes down, pretending they did not see the king pull his hand away from Anne's cold fingers, pretending they did not hear him mutter under his breath, "I was a fool to think God had chosen you for me." But they heard, clearly, and they knew Henry was already retreating. Weeks later, Thomas Cromwell came to see Anne, a secret meeting recorded nowhere. The ladies stood only steps away. They could not hear every word, but they saw enough. Cromwell no longer bowed as he once did. He spoke with the voice of the man in control. Anne replied with the voice of a woman who knew she had already lost. After that night, the light in her face dimmed, and every lady knew Cromwell had drawn the final line. The day Anne was arrested, the ladies were the first to see the soldiers enter. They heard the pounding on the door, strong enough to shake the frame, and they saw Anne, unpainted, uncrowned, simply a terrified young woman, dragged from her chamber. She turned and said to them words they carried for the rest of their lives. "Do not let them write my story the way they wish." The days in the Tower of London are the ones the ladies kept most fiercely guarded. 3 of them were assigned to watch Anne day and night, not to protect her, but to monitor her, to ensure she did not speak any secret that could endanger the king. They saw Anne cry, but not from fear of death. She cried because she knew Henry had so easily believed lies about her. They saw her write a long letter, said to be addressed to Henry, though Cromwell confiscated it and never delivered it. A lady remembered Anne whispering every line as she wrote, "If I have sinned, may God take my life. But if I am innocent and still must die, then may God judge you for what you have done." When Cromwell entered, he did not allow her to fold the letter. He simply watched, smiled faintly, and took it as though it were his trophy. The ladies saw it clearly, and they knew Henry would never read Anne's final words. On the night before the execution, the ladies dressed Anne in her last gown, a simple gray dress without jewels, and held the hand of a young lady and said a sentence she never forgot. "I feel relieved. At least tomorrow I will know whether death still hurts after it arrives." In her final hours, she prayed, not for herself, but for Elizabeth, the child who would be abandoned by the father who once swore to love both mother and daughter, and it was the ladies who heard her prayer. At dawn, as Anne stepped onto the scaffold, the ladies stood behind her, hands clenched white. They saw Anne kneel, her dark hair neatly pinned, the sunlight falling softly across her serene face. They heard her declare, "May God protect my king, whom I have loved more deeply than can ever be measured." These were not words of submission. They were Anne protecting Elizabeth. One wrong word, and her daughter's life would be at risk. The sword flashed, so fast the ladies couldn't cry in time, and when Anne's head fell, one of them collapsed. Not from shock, but because she heard something no one else ever did. Henry's sigh from the distance. Not grief, relief. After Anne's body was placed in a crude wooden coffin, the ladies were ordered to leave the tower immediately. But before they left, They found Anne's embroidered handkerchief, the one with the letter A, that Cromwell had discarded like worthless cloth. One lady picked it up and kept it until the day she died. No one knows where it is now. Anne's ladies carried her story with them all their lives, yet they never spoke it aloud, not because they wanted to forget, but because they knew the truth of Anne Boleyn's destruction was not simply Cromwell's fault, nor Henry's, nor the court's. But with quasi-precipitous, the lady picked up the stick. It was a fate sealed, because Anne was too intelligent, too sharp, too dangerous for a world that could not tolerate a woman like her, and the only people who saw the full truth, her ladies-in-waiting, chose silence. Silence so deep that history believed they never existed. But tonight, in the dark, we have heard them speak again. Catherine Howard appeared in the Tudor court like a careless spark slipping into a fortress of cold gray walls. Walls far too used to silence and frost. A 17-year-old girl so radiant that the entire court seemed to awaken simply because she turned her head and smiled. Henry VIII, aging and suspicious, looked at her the way a dying man looks at a well, with hunger, desperation, and something like worship. But from the very first moment, the women closest to her, the silent ladies who followed her every step, saw what the king could not. Catherine's smile was not the smile of a carefree girl. It was the smile of someone whose past was chasing at her heels, someone who smiled quickly to cover a fear that moved even faster, someone who had been handed a crown and a noose. They saw everything in the smallest details. When Catherine sat down, she always angled her knees toward the wall, a habit learned by a girl raised in a place where every male footstep in the hallway could mean an unwanted summons. When she changed gowns, her fingers sometimes trembled faintly at the ties on her back, trembled not from cold, but from memory. When she looked in the mirror, her eyes only sparkled when someone else was in the room, and when she was alone, those eyes dimmed like water troubled by a stone. And the women beside her each morning and night understood this better than anyone. Catherine was, in Henry's eyes, the rose without a thorn. But to the women behind her, the ones who tied her ribbons, combed her rose-scented hair, and heard each midnight sigh, they knew Catherine was no thornless rose. Catherine was a rose with so many thorns she had to hide them to survive. The court never knew that she burned old letters in the coal grate before entering palace life, but someone close enough had seen the flecks of scorched paper left in the corner of the hearth. The court never knew she flinched when someone spoke the name Derham, but one lady heard her mumble that name in her sleep, voice stuttering as though she were trying to lock a memory away and failing, and the court certainly never knew that the letters she wrote in her private chamber, letters folded 4 times and hidden inside the silk lining of her jewelry box, were not for Henry. They were not the romantic love notes the world likes to imagine. They were the letters of a woman begging someone else to keep silent. Then Thomas Culpeper entered her life, not like moonlight on a still lake, but like a shadow coming from the Black Forest. People would later speak of them as lovers. Some claimed they whispered to each other, exchanged glances full of longing in palace corridors. But those who stood closer to Catherine, those who saw her when the doors closed, knew the truth was far more complicated. Culpeper was not simply a seducer. He was a man who knew too much. When Catherine saw him, she did not blush. She went pale. When he approached, she did not smile. She froze, as though pushed back into a dark corner with no way out. One winter evening, candlelight flickered across wooden panels, turning every shadow into an open mouth. A woman who always stood beside Catherine at dressing hour later said that Catherine suddenly stopped while brushing her hair. Her hand dropped the comb and she stood still, staring at the crack beneath the door. Outside, footsteps moved, silent, slow, and the servant recognized that sound instantly. Without seeing the face, she knew who was approaching. Culpeper, When he passed into the next hallway, Catherine released a breath like someone escaping an invisible hand around her throat. The court never knew that moment happened. Oh! But someone had heard that breath. And then the whispers began. Small comments in dark corners, eyes avoiding other eyes, rumors drifting like dust. Light, gentle, but each particle carrying death with it. This was when Cromwell caught the scent of an easy kill, and when Cromwell wanted prey, he only had to stand still, because the court itself would push Catherine straight into the trap. On a leaden gray afternoon, Henry's face changed abruptly as he read a paper delivered by Cranmer. No one knew what was written, but everyone saw the way Henry ripped his hand from the table, stood up sharply, and left his dinner untouched. And everyone saw Catherine collapse into her chair, her lips trembling as though she had just swallowed hot ash. But only the women at her side heard her whisper once the room emptied. They found out. That night, Catherine did not sleep. Servants standing outside said they heard her open every drawer, every small box, every scrap of paper, not to hide things, but to decide what had to be destroyed before dawn. A handkerchief was torn apart. A scrap of parchment was held so close to a candle that the flame nearly took the curtain. They did not see what was inside those boxes, but they heard her soft sob when the fire kissed her skin. The next morning, when the rumors became official, Catherine did something no queen was expected to do. She ran. Someone from her household later said Catherine flew down the corridor as if flames chased her feet, her hair loose, her gown trailing behind her, and her voice, "Henry, please hear me," echoing through the palace like the cry of someone drowning. But Henry's door slammed shut at the exact moment she reached it. She pounded on it with all her strength, then she stopped, then she stood still, and finally she collapsed, as though the floor had been pulled from beneath her. That was when it truly ended. When Catherine was taken to the Tower of London, those closest to her said she did not ask why. She only asked, "Who else knows?" As if the thing she feared most was not death, but her long-hidden secrets being twisted into someone else's story. During her confinement, Catherine was not frantic like Mary Stuart, nor desolate like Anne Boleyn. She was empty, as though she had left her soul in the hallway where Henry refused to see her. One servant delivering food found her sitting on the floor, head against the wall, hands in her lap, as though preparing for the execution. Already no tears, no pleas, no grief, only waiting. As though fate had arrived long ago and she had simply run slower than it. On her final night, a woman stationed closest to her chamber said Catherine repeated one line over and over, "I only want them to remember me right. Not beautiful, not innocent, not perfect, just right." Because she knew the court would carve her story with a pen that never showed mercy. The next morning was so cold, the air turned to white smoke with each breath. Catherine walked to the scaffold like a thin ribbon caught by the wind. People said she looked calm, but the woman who stood closest on that final walk knew better. She was not calm, she was resigned, and resignation is the cruelest kind of calm. When the blade came down, the sound was not grand or echoing like the legends claim. It was short, clean, cold, like the sound of a final secret being severed from the heart of the one who kept it. Years later, when an old chamber of Hampton Court was being cleared, a small object was found lodged between two floorboards, a handkerchief embroidered with the letter C, a faint trail of dried tears along its edge. No one knew when it was hidden, or by whom, or why it remained there, but those who understood the story knew exactly what it was. A relic of a truth the court tried to bury, a truth only those who stood close enough to Catherine ever knew. If Catherine Howard's story was the fear of being hunted by her past, then Elizabeth I's story was the fear of her past turning into a blade suspended above her throne. No one in the Tudor court could have imagined that the greatest queen in English history, the woman they worshipped as the Virgin Queen, held a secret powerful enough to destroy the very foundation of her reign with a single whisper. But there were things Elizabeth never said, never wrote, never allowed the world to touch. Only a very small circle, the ladies who stood closest to her, who dressed her, who combed her hair, who waited in her bedchamber, ever truly knew this truth, and it was a truth they carried into the dark along with their own lives. The story does not begin when Elizabeth was crowned, but when she turned 14. A thin, razor-bright girl living in a household full of listening walls, where every corridor was a trap. Thomas Seymour. The name that even decades later made Elizabeth flinch when someone mentioned it by accident. A name that made the women around her exchange silent glances, as if one loud sound might wake a monster sleeping under the stone floors. Elizabeth lived then with Catherine Parr, the gentle stepmother who loved her more honestly than anyone else ever had. But in that same house, Seymour, handsome, young, ambitious, and shameless, saw in Elizabeth a power he both desired and wanted to possess. The ladies who served Elizabeth wrote in journals buried so deeply they were never meant to be found, that Elizabeth came out of her room each morning trying to feign calm, though her eyes were red from lack of sleep. They saw Seymour entering her room earlier than any man had the right to. They heard his laughter behind her half-closed door, then Elizabeth's voice, quick, urgent, too soft to hear clearly. But it was not the voice of a carefree girl. It was the voice of a girl trying to reach the one thing every Tudor woman understood instinctively, her own safety. A young servant witnessed something history only dares summarize in a few careful words. Seymour, playing with Elizabeth in the garden, chasing her around as if it were harmless fun, while Catherine Parr, realizing exactly what was happening, burst into tears of rage, something almost unheard of from her. What the records do not show is the terror in Elizabeth's face when she was taken inside afterward. A lady standing beside her wrote that Elizabeth kept repeating one trembling question: "What have I done wrong?" No one answered her, because the answer was Seymour, not her. Then came the incident Catherine Parr never spoke about publicly. One morning, while Elizabeth was still in her bedchamber, Seymour entered. No knock. No permission, no fear of being seen. When Catherine Parr opened the door, she found Elizabeth backed against the wall, hair disheveled, eyes wide with panic, while Seymour smiled as though it were a harmless joke. The lady standing just behind Catherine saw what Catherine did not say aloud. Elizabeth was shaking like a bird pinned into a corner. When the situation went too far, Catherine Parr did the only thing a true mother could do. She sent Elizabeth away, not because she disliked her, but because she knew that if Elizabeth stayed, she would be dragged into a scandal so poisonous it would destroy her forever. And Catherine Parr, out of the greatest love, sacrificed her own marriage to save Elizabeth, but the danger did not end there. Seymour was executed after plotting to kidnap the young King Edward VI, and the truth about what he had done to Elizabeth, preserved in witness testimonies, became a loaded weapon. A single rumor could make Elizabeth unfit to rule. The Tudor world never forgave a woman entangled in sexual scandal, and this secret Elizabeth knew would annihilate her life before it even began. This is why, when Elizabeth became queen, her old fear did not vanish, it changed shape. It hardened into absolute caution around any man who came near her. Her ladies who watched her life in complete silence noticed something no one else did. Elizabeth never allowed herself to be alone in a closed room with a man. Not even Robert Dudley, the one man she truly loved. There was never a moment with just the two of them. There was always at least one woman present. Never a door fully closed unless an eye watched from outside. Elizabeth never explained why, but the ladies knew. When Elizabeth looked into the mirror and said, "I will not marry, I belong to England," her voice carried a faint tremor that only those closest to her could hear. It wasn't the tremor of divine calling. It was the tremor of a vow made for survival. So when Robert Dudley appeared with his tender eyes and words that made Elizabeth glow in ways she never allowed herself to, the ladies knew this was dangerous. Not dangerous for the Queen, but for the nation, because any whisper of a romance involving Elizabeth could be turned into a weapon by her enemies. Then came the day Amy Robsart Dudley's wife died under suspicious circumstances at the bottom of a staircase, and England erupted like dry grass catching fire. Accusations, outrage, rumors. People claimed Dudley murdered his wife to marry Elizabeth. People claimed Elizabeth was involved. People said the Virgin Queen was neither pure nor sacred, but the women closest to her knew how she responded. They didn't just see her cry. They saw her collapse into a chair, clutching her head, whispering, "If they believe I had any part in this, I will lose everything." Years later, an elderly lady in waiting wrote in a sealed diary, "In that moment, I did not see a queen. I saw a child strangled by her past once more." But there was something else no one knew, except a few women who served Elizabeth for life. For 10 years after Amy Robsart's death, Elizabeth kept a small wooden box, no name, no royal crest. No one knew what was inside, but one lady claimed she once glimpsed the Queen opening it late at night. She saw Elizabeth holding an old letter, her hands trembling as if every word on it were a blade carving into her heart. No one knew who wrote it, and no one dared guess. But when Elizabeth closed the box, her shoulders collapsed in a way they never did in front of her court. The frightening part is that Elizabeth never spoke of the box. Yet every time a war loomed, every time an assassination plot surfaced, every time a decision could change the fate of England, she touched that box before leaving the room, as if it reminded her that a single wrong step would let the past destroy her. And then came the greatest secret, the one her ladies carried into their graves, a secret never recorded in any official archive, a secret that explains why Elizabeth never allowed anyone but her ladies to touch her body. In 1562, when Elizabeth caught smallpox, the entire court believed she would die. She burned with fever, delirious, her face so damaged that her ladies had to remove and replace cloths every hour to prevent her skin from decaying. Once her skin from decaying, one brutal night, an elderly lady in waiting dropped a cup because she heard Elizabeth mutter in her fever, "Don't let them look at me. Don't let them see me weak." The ladies later said that in her delirium, when death seemed close, Elizabeth confessed her deepest fear. "If I die like this, they will write me the way they want. They will take everything from me." And that was the moment the ladies vowed to protect her truth, not the truth of history, but the truth of Elizabeth the woman. They hid letters she didn't want the court to see. They burned rumors the moment they surfaced. They kept watch by her bed when Elizabeth trusted no one, not even Dudley. They wiped her tears when she signed the death warrant of the man she loved most, Mary, Queen of Scots. One of her closest ladies once said, "The Queen never feared losing her crown. She feared losing the image that kept her old demons away." At the end of her life, when Elizabeth was exhausted, sleepless, refusing even to lie down because she believed if she did, she would never rise again, it was her ladies alone who saw her break. The great Elizabeth, England's glory, sat motionless for 3 days on a pile of cushions, eyes wide in the dark, whispering, "What will they say of me when I'm gone? I've lived my whole life so they'd have no weapon left to use against me. Will they understand that?" The lady closest to her took her hand and said the sentence history never recorded, "Your Majesty, they will only see your light. Leave the shadows to us." And they did. When Elizabeth died, the small wooden box vanished. The letters disappeared. The records from her private chambers were gathered and burned. Her fever-born confessions were buried in silence. No trace remained of what she had spent her life protecting. Even when her tomb was opened, history's pen could not touch that truth. Because it no longer existed in this world, it lay beneath the earth with the women who served her with their entire lives, carrying the final secret of Elizabeth I into the dark. And that truth, no one knows, no one hears, no one sees. Only one thing is certain. Had those women not remained silent, the Tudor dynasty would have collapsed in a way no one could ever have imagined. Mary Tudor is remembered by history as a woman made of fire, faith like red-hot steel, a heart like a drawn blade, and a resolve no force could break. But behind the name Bloody Mary, behind the flames that consumed hundreds of heretics, behind the crown forged out of loneliness, there was a woman only a very few ever saw. A Mary haunted by a stolen childhood, by the humiliation of being declared a bastard, by the nights she trembled from the cold created by her own isolation, and in her final days, when her breath shortened and death stood beside her bed, a letter appeared, a letter her ladies burned that very night, one containing a truth powerful enough to shatter the image of a queen history thought it understood. It began with rain, damp, icy London night that felt like a cold hand pressed into unhealed wounds. Mary lay in her chamber at St. James's Palace, her breath heavy and slowing like the last grains in an hourglass. Her ladies, the women who had followed her since she had been cast out of court as a young girl, stood beside her bed, watching the small spasms tighten Mary's jaw. They knew that sign. Mary was about to speak or confess something she had held inside for too long, but Mary opened her eyes only to ask one question. "Is there a letter?" A young lady stepped to the table and saw an old envelope sealed with wax cracked by age. She handed it to Mary. Mary held it with trembling hands as though she were touching her own heart, and when her eyes settled on the wax seal, every woman in the room felt a chill, because it was the deep red wax used only by Thomas Cranmer. But Cranmer had been burned alive by Mary years before, so how was this letter still in existence? Mary bit her lip, closed her eyes, and opened it. As she read the first lines, her eyes widened, as if time snapped back 30 years to when she was torn from her mother's arms, to Catherine of Aragon's face fading into shadow, to Henry VIII shouting that she was no longer a princess. The ladies watched Mary's shoulders heave. They dared not touch her. No one wanted to see their queen break. But Mary kept reading, and then one tear fell onto the paper. The first tear Mary had shed in the long months her kingdom had been collapsing around her. What did the letter say? Only Mary and the 3 women closest to her knew, and each was bound by a vow of silence no court could ever break. But years later, long after they had left the palace, they told only this. The letter had 2 parts, a confession and a warning. The confession was something Mary never wanted the world to know, that her mother's death, Catherine of Aragon's death, was not as natural as history recorded. The writer claimed he had heard, from the mouth of someone close to Henry, that Catherine had been weakened, not felled by illness. When Mary reached that sentence, her fingers clenched the paper so hard it almost tore. She spoke through her teeth, her voice like flame. "I knew. I always knew." She had long suspected Henry wanted her mother gone, but now, on the edge of death, she realized those suspicions were not merely a daughter's grief. They were truth. A truth buried by a court full of men. The second part of the letter, the part that forced her ladies to burn it, carried a warning. If Mary bears no child, if the Tudor line does not continue, the throne will pass to Elizabeth. But Elizabeth was not born of a lawful marriage. If Mary dies childless, Elizabeth can never truly be rightful. When Mary reached that line, her ladies saw a strange light spark in her eyes. Not anger, but a bitterness so cold it hurt to witness. Mary laughed, thin as a knife blade. "Still, I tried to give them an heir." Then she began to shake, not from illness, but from memory. Because the ladies knew what she had endured trying to become pregnant. They had seen her belly swell, then sink. They had heard her whisper in the midnight hours, "Mother, I do not want to become you." They had seen her pray until her knees bled. They were the only ones who knew that most of Mary's pain came not from sickness, but from hope crushed again and again. Now, holding the letter, Mary whispered, "I lived it all wrong." The eldest lady, the one who had served Mary since she'd been exiled to the miserable house at Hatfield, moved as if to sit beside her. But Mary lifted her hand. She was still a queen, and a queen could not break in front of anyone, not even those who had seen her weep, tremble, and crumble more than the entire world ever had. And then, Mary did something none of them had seen her do. She turned to one of the young ladies and said, "If I die, this letter must not survive." The girl asked, "Your Majesty, what must we do?" Mary looked directly into her eyes, the eyes that had seen Mary at her most desperate, and said, "Burn it. Burn it before the court finds it. Burn it so Elizabeth never learns what they did to my mother. Burn it so this bloodline isn't gutted again." A silence heavy as iron fell across the room, because they all understood. The letter didn't just expose the past. It could detonate the future. If Elizabeth, the half-sister she had never truly hated, discovered the truth about Catherine of Aragon's death, the world would explode. The wound between them would burn open again. The Tudor bloodline would end, not by fate, but by the sword. Mary looked at the letter one last time, her eyes blurred not from sickness, but from understanding that her entire life had been a war fought for her mother's honor. And now, at the very end, she had to protect her sister's honor by burying the truth forever. One lady took the letter, her hands shaking so hard the parchment fluttered like a dry leaf. She stepped into the next room where a small hearth burned. The others watched through the door crack, a yellowed page, a flash of blue flame, and in seconds Mary Tudor's final secret, a secret that could have changed the fate of England, turned to ash. When the lady returned to the bedside, Mary looked at her weak but unmistakably clear. "You have seen so much of me, of my mother, of Elizabeth. Keep silent." The girl nodded. Mary spoke her last words before falling unconscious. "They only know me as Bloody Mary, but you know I am not that. Let them keep their story. You keep the truth." Mary died at dawn. Her face was no longer tight with strain. Some said she looked relieved, as if she had finally set down a burden she had carried her whole life. But the women who had stood beside her, who had seen the final moment, knew Mary did not die in peace. She died holding a secret history never had the courage to record. A secret burned, yet never truly gone, because ash can scatter. But the memory of those who watched it burn never disappears. Anne of Cleves was the only woman who ever walked into Henry VIII's life and walked out of it still alive, still free, and still smiling. It was so strange that the entire court whispered, Anne must have carried some sort of spell, but those who stood closest to her knew the truth. There was no spell, only wisdom, perfectly timed silence, and a secret Anne and her women swore never to reveal. A secret that forced Henry VIII to let her go without daring to touch a single hair on her head. It all began in the winter of 1540, when Anne arrived in England after a marriage arranged through the beautifully deceptive portraits of Hans Holbein. Henry, wealthy and sick with fantasy, believed he was getting a northern fairy. But when he saw Anne for the first time, he was so furious he nearly smashed the lute the musicians were playing, simply because Anne did not look like her painting. But that was only the surface of the iceberg. The women who had traveled with Anne from Cleves to England witnessed something else. Anne had known this would happen long before she ever met Henry. They later said that the night before she boarded the ship, Anne called a handful of her old attendants into her room and handed them small objects, a lace scrap, a silver cross, a silk kerchief, and told them, "If I do not return, keep these as proof that I was never a fool." Her words were sharp, as though she already understood that her future would test her with something cruel. And she was right. On her first night at Hampton Court, Anne knew Henry would come to inspect the merchandise, as the crude men of court called it among themselves. But her ladies from Cleves had done something unusual. They shifted their duties, swapped stations, and positioned themselves near the door, subtly yet skillfully preventing Henry from approaching Anne the way he intended, not through rebellion, not through defiance, but through a kind of quiet coordination only women who understood each other could execute. One lady close to Anne said that when Henry finally stepped into the room, he seemed unsettled. The candles had been dimmed too low to let him see properly. Anne bowed at the exact proper angle, but did not look desperate or eager to please. And just as Henry moved nearer, one of the ladies accidentally dropped a candle, plunging the room into darkness for a few seconds. That moment changed everything. Henry, a man whose entire identity depended on control, lost it for those brief 3 seconds. When the light returned, he appeared distant, hesitant, and withdrew. Not because Anne was unattractive, but because in the darkness, something had made Henry afraid. No one knew what happened in those seconds, but one older woman, Anne's oldest attendant, said years later, Henry saw something he did not want to confront. No one understood what she meant. Some believed Henry saw the shadow of his own aging reflected in Anne's unflinching eyes. Others whispered that Anne's calm reminded him of Catherine of Aragon, the one woman whose memory tormented him until his death. And some claimed Henry heard a whisper in German floating in the dark, "I am not your object." Nothing was ever confirmed, but soon after that night, Henry declared he could not consummate the marriage. It sounded ridiculous, but her ladies knew the truth. Men only make excuses when they fear something else. What Henry feared was that Anne did not belong to the kind of woman he was used to crushing. As the court prepared the annulment, one day Anne vanished from her chambers. No one knew where she had gone. Her ladies scattered through the palace to search. One found Anne in the chapel, kneeling before the altar with a face both wounded and resolute. Anne whispered, "If I want to live, I must let go of the title of queen." A wise woman knows when to release her grip. Then she added something that made the witness shiver. "But there is something Henry must never know." The lady asked, "My lady, what is it?" Anne replied, "The thing that forces him to let me live." No one ever learned her meaning. But that night, Anne summoned all her closest women into her room and made them swear before the cross that whatever she was about to say or do would die with them. Never written, never whispered, never revealed, not even to Elizabeth or Mary. And after that, Anne disappeared from court with Henry's relief, something so shocking the entire country gaped. How could a woman walk away from Henry VIII without being executed? Only a handful of her ladies knew the answer. They witnessed Anne handing a small object inside a silk-covered box to Henry's messenger. No one in history knows what it was, but moments after receiving it, Henry softened, stopped raging, and sent Anne away with a generous fortune and the bizarre title, Sister of the King. Some said the object was an old letter from someone Henry had once loved with devastating intensity. Others believed it was a piece of evidence that would have caused a political catastrophe if Anne were harmed. Still others whispered that it wasn't an object at all, that Anne whispered a single threat, soft enough for only Henry to hear, but sharp enough to make him step back. Whatever the truth, her ladies knew only one thing. Anne won, not with beauty, not with seduction, not with steel, but with knowledge. With strategy, with the one thing the Tudor court always underestimated: the silent intelligence of women. When Anne left court, her ladies watched her go, aware that they were not merely escorting a former queen. They were witnessing the exit of a woman who survived the blood-soaked labyrinth of Henry VIII by using exactly what the Tudor world dismissed: the clarity and cunning of a woman. Years later, after Henry was dead, after Edward passed, After Mary's reign ended and Elizabeth took the throne, someone asked Anne which of Henry's children was the most deserving ruler. Anne simply smiled and said, "The one who knows how to listen to women." And her ladies knew that was the only person Anne ever trusted. Anne's story does not end with death or tragedy. It ends with freedom. But what she left behind, the vow of silence carried by the women who walked beside her, still shadows history like something no one can ever fully touch. Because sometimes the most powerful force in the Tudor world was not the sword, not the crown, but the secrets women kept. Catherine Parr is always remembered as the one who survived, but those who lived with her in the cold corridors of Hampton Court knew that her survival had nothing to do with luck. It was the sharpness of her mind, the precision of her silence, and the secrets she was forced to bury within that silence. In a court where a woman's words could become evidence of treason overnight, Catherine understood that her true protection did not come from love, but from knowing when to fear and whom to fear. And because of that, her ladies, the silent figures who shadowed her every step, became the only witnesses to the moment Catherine confessed something that, had Henry VIII heard it, she would have been dragged away in the dead of night without even a scream. It began on the nights Catherine sat by a small table writing, under the slanted flame of a candle, the golden light flickering across eyes filled with fierce determination. She did not write to record her life, but to record her soul, meditations on faith, salvation, and personal belief. Dangerous things, words that under Henry's reign were enough to make a woman's signature her own death sentence. Her ladies watched, their faces purple with fear, but none dared to stop her. One whispered, "If the king finds out," and Catherine replied in a voice soft but icy, "The king knows many things, but not all." Then one night, winds howling through the shutters, Henry groaning in the next room as his infected leg throbbed like a beast, Catherine wrote a passage so long her hand went numb. When she put the pen down, her eyes glistened with an emotion none of them had seen before. A lady asked timidly, "Your Majesty, what have you written?" Catherine looked at her with deep, burning eyes and said, "I confess to heresy." No one breathed. Their faces drained white, as if death itself had just stepped through the door. For those two words, heresy, were enough to burn the entire court, and Catherine would be the first consumed. Before anyone could react, rushing footsteps thundered down the hall. A lady burst in, terrified. "Gardiner has told the king. They're speaking of arresting the queen." Catherine stood so abruptly her chair crashed backward. The youngest maid trembled. "Where is the manuscript? What you wrote? Where is it?" Catherine looked down at the wooden box full of papers and whispered, "If they find it, I die." In that instant, her ladies moved. No orders, no hesitation. Just the instinct of women who had lived too long beside Henry VIII's shadow of death. One gathered pages. One blew out the candles to mask the smell of ink. One clawed at an old floorboard until it popped up, revealing a dark hollow beneath. The pages of Catherine's confession were shoved inside, sheet by sheet, their hands shaking so hard the paper rattled like dry leaves. Catherine stood back, her hands clenched white. The moment the plank snapped shut, the chamber door burst open so violently one lady nearly screamed. Henry VIII stood there, smelling of infection and fury, eyes red like a wounded beast. "They say you are writing a book," he growled, his voice dragging across the stone like a blade. Catherine sank to her knees, not trembling, not crying, but lifting her face with the soft submission she had learned over a lifetime of surviving men. "Your Majesty," she said gently, as if soothing a child, "I write only of my devotion to you, of love, of my duty to you." Henry froze, as if the blow he intended to strike dissolved mid-air. The nearest lady heard his breathing hitch, anger draining, suspicion collapsing under the weight of his own pride. "I thought you meant to instruct me in faith," he snarled. "No, Your Majesty," Catherine replied. "I only wanted to understand you better." That sentence, exactly that sentence, saved her life. Henry fell into a chair, reaching out for balance. "Come here," he said. Catherine rose, walked to him, placed her hand in his, and in that moment every lady in the room knew. They had pulled their queen back from the sword Henry had already sharpened in his heart. He kissed her forehead and left without looking back. When the door closed, one maid collapsed to the floor, clutching her chest, certain she had nearly died. Catherine stood, trembling like a string pulled too tight. Her first question when she finally caught her breath was, "Did you hide it well?" Another maid gasped, "If they find it, all of us die." Catherine answered, "That is why you must live, to carry my secret." The secret lay under the floor, in the darkness beneath old wood. A confession powerful enough to bring down a crown. And worse, it remained there even after Henry VIII was dead. Catherine lived a few more years, the happiest widow in England, married to Thomas Seymour. But she never returned to that room, never lifted that floorboard, never spoke the confession again. Until the day she died from childbirth fever, sobbing and delirious, Catherine uttered one final plea. "Do not let them find what I wrote." Years later, an aging lady-in-waiting returned to Hampton Court alone. She entered Catherine's old chamber, laid her hand on the wooden plank and whispered, "We kept our promise." She lifted the board. There was nothing underneath. Empty. Someone had taken it. Or perhaps Catherine herself had returned in the night before her death to reclaim her confession. No one alive knew. Only one truth remained. The confession that could have killed a queen vanished from history, but never from the memory of the women who knelt on that floor the night Henry intended to strike. Lady Jane Grey lived as Queen of England for just 9 days, but her final night, the night her ladies heard her true last words, stretched like a century. It was a night when the silence inside the Tower of London grew so heavy it felt capable of crushing the chest of anyone brave enough to step into those pale stone corridors, and only the women closest to Jane, who watched her carefully crafted calm crack beneath the velvet of her composure, knew that Jane Grey did not die because of someone else's ambition, or politics, or betrayal. She died because of a truth the crown would never allow her to speak. As the sun slipped behind the thick walls and the white tower sank into darkness, Jane sat in her small cell with her hands resting on an open Bible. Not to pray, but to keep them from shaking. She had pretended to be strong for weeks, pretended to be serene when Mary claimed the throne, pretended to be unbothered when her husband was taken away, pretended to be unmoved by the sound of the executioner sharpening his axe outside. But that night, for the first time, Jane breathed like someone finally facing the real ghost haunting her. When the cell door opened, 2 young ladies entered, allowed to stay with her to prepare her for death. They carried candles, white cloth, and water, but more importantly, they brought the one thing Jane needed most: ears that could receive the truth she had never dared to put into words. They saw Jane look up, her usually calm eyes now deep as a midnight abyss. Then she said, "Sit. I need to speak this to someone who will live to remember it." The ladies froze. No one expected Jane to want to say anything on her final night. One whispered, "My lady, do you wish to confess?" Jane shook her head. "No, I am innocent. I committed no crime Rome or London can judge me for. I want to speak of the truth." The women exchanged terrified glances. In the tower, the word truth was more dangerous than any blade. But Jane continued, "I must say it, and I will only say it once." She rose. The candlelight carved her face into a portrait of exhaustion, sharpened by the brilliance of a mind forced to grow old too fast. She walked to the tiny window overlooking the courtyard, where she would stand the next morning. Then, with the slow precision of a curse being spoken, she said, "I never wanted to be queen." One lady tried to steady her voice. "Then who forced you?" Jane turned, her voice a blade. "Not Dudley. Not my father. Not my mother. They only believed they were controlling me. But the person who truly pushed me onto that throne is the king this country now worships as its great hope." The ladies inhaled sharply. "You mean Edward?" Jane nodded, not gently, but with the fierce finality of someone cutting a rope that had been strangling her. She stepped closer to the trembling women. "Edward died of sickness, yes, but he knew he was dying, and he feared Mary. He feared the return of Rome. He feared losing England to the Virgin Mother and the Church. Everything he believed in, everything he built, he placed in my hands. I was his only option." "But," one whispered, "you always said you did not want the crown." Jane laughed, a small bitter sound. "I did not. But Edward wanted me to take it. He begged me. He said, 'Jane, you are the only one who can save this kingdom.'" Jane gripped her skirt, her voice cracking. "I refused 3 times. Mary's brother nearly cried. I never told anyone because no one believes a woman can refuse a crown. But I did refuse." The ladies stared at her, stunned, watching history unravel right in front of them. "If you refused," one said, "why did you finally accept?" Jane closed her eyes. Silence hovered long enough for them to hear the wind slipping through the stones. And Jane spoke the sentence that no one, not one soul in England ever heard. "Because Edward said that if I refused, I would kill him." The ladies fell numb. "He said kill," Jane continued. "He believed that if Mary ruled, everything he built would be destroyed. His faith, his laws, his soul. And I could not say no." One lady burst into tears, but Jane only shook her head. "Do not cry for me. Cry for England, for they will never know that Edward, the young king they mourn, forced me to take the crown with the weight of his dying fear." Jane moved closer, so close her breath mingled with theirs. Then she spoke the truth that would be buried with them. "I do not die because of Mary. I die because of Edward." The words fell like a stone into the world, too heavy to hold. No one moved. No one spoke. No one had been prepared for this. Because if that truth ever left the room, not just reign, but the faith of an entire kingdom would shatter. Jane knelt. "This is the truth I will carry to my grave. But I did not want it to vanish unheard. Someone should know that I was not a puppet built by a council." The older lady whispered, "We will keep it." Jane studied them. "No, you will bury it. Bury it as though you never heard. If anyone knows I was forced, the people will raise my name against Mary, and thousands will die." The ladies bowed, not in obedience, but in awe. For Jane had become a queen not during her 9 days on the throne, but tonight, by choosing the lives of others over her own legacy. As midnight struck, Jane sat down and leaned her head against the cold stone wall. One lady placed a cloth under her, but Jane refused. "I want to feel the cold, to remember I am still human." Then she whispered the final words that haunted the 2 women for the rest of their lives. "When I place my head on the block, they will say I die for treason. But you know the truth. I die for the secret of a dying king, a secret I protected with my life." The next morning, when Jane stepped into the execution yard, the slight young girl did not tremble, did not weep, did not plead. She simply asked, "Where is my block?" so calmly that the executioner turned his face away. No one knew that as Jane knelt, hands searching the air until they found the block. The 2 ladies in the crowd clutched each other so tightly their palms bled. One whispered through tears, "We know her truth." And then the axe fell. That truth, Jane Grey's final whispered truth, was never written, never recorded, never spoken again. No one dared. No one wanted to. But the women who heard Jane say, I'd die for the king's secret, carried it to the ends of their lives. Because some truths are not meant for history. They survive only as a haunting in the hearts of those who heard them, spoken on one night, and one night only. There are nights in the Tudor court that never made it into the chronicles, not because people forgot them, but because people were afraid. And among all those nights, one stands above the rest. The terrifying night when the ladies of Hampton Court realized they had witnessed something no one in the kingdom was ever meant to see. Something that should have died with Henry VIII's buried queens. The night began with nothing unusual, only the heavy drumming of rain against the glass and a candle flickering in the damp stone corridors. But it was always on the seemingly ordinary nights in the Tudor court that the darkness found its way to the surface. A group of ladies on night duty moved through the East Corridor, the one that used to belong to Anne Boleyn before she was bound and taken away. No one liked patrolling that wing. On rainy nights, moisture streaked down the white walls like sliding fingerprints. One whispered, voice trembling, "These walls, remember her." But they had to continue. Duty was duty. As they neared Anne's old chambers, the door suddenly swung open. No wind, no footsteps, no one running away, just the door opening, slowly, lightly, as if inviting them in. All four froze. One breathed. That door has been sealed since she died. They stepped back, but the heavy thud of boots echoed at the far end of the hall, the iron-soled kind worn only by guards. If they were found near a forbidden room, they would be questioned, accused, perhaps tortured. They had no choice. The four women slipped into the room and closed the door behind them. The moment it shut, their candle died. No wind, no noise, no draft. The flame simply choked out, as if something squeezed it. In the suffocating dark, one whispered, trembling, "Light it again." But before they could, a faint sound drifted from deep inside the walls, a sound no living person makes. Fabric dragging, light footsteps, breathing, not belonging to any of them. Three of the ladies clutched each other, but the one nearest the wall backed away, her spine touching the cold stone, only to feel it quiver. The stone behind her was vibrating as if something inside it was trying to get out. One woman screamed instinctively, but clamped her own hand over her mouth. No noise, no mistake, no attention, but the question struck every mind at once. Who or what is in the wall? Their breaths thickened like mud. One lady struck her flint, trying to relight the candle. Another grabbed her wrist. "Don't, if the guards—" Too late. The spark flared, and in that split-second flash before the wick fully caught, they saw a figure standing in the corner. Motionless, breathless, lifeless, standing exactly where legend claimed Anne Boleyn had knelt to pray for the last time before she was taken away. When the spark faded, the figure vanished. The candle flared to life. The room stood empty, but the wall kept vibrating, harder. One choked out, "No, no, it can't." The oldest whispered, "This is not the dead. This is a secret." And then the stone slab shifted. Not fully, just enough to reveal paper. A stack of old papers wedged inside the hidden cavity as though someone had tried to conceal them but hadn't finished. A young lady trembled, "We must not touch it. It belongs to the dead." The oldest answered, her voice like iron, "No, it belongs to those who know how to keep silent." She reached into the gap and pulled out the yellowing pages. When the candlelight fell across the ink, they read the first line. "If they discover this truth, let no one blame me for saying it first. This court will be destroyed by the very people it made." No signature, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Catherine Howard. One of the ladies sobbed, not from fear this time, but from knowing they were holding not just a secret, but evidence of a crime. The second page was worse. "I know who lied to kill Anne." All four went rigid as carved stone. That sentence alone could decapitate half the royal household. They didn't get to read further because footsteps began echoing across the room, soft, light, but drawing closer. Not guards, not living, footsteps without weight. Two women clapped hands over their mouths to stop a scream. Then a voice, thin as a single thread, whispered from the crack in the stone. "Do not read further." No one needed to know who it was. No one wanted to know. They only knew that if they turned another page, whether it was truth or ghost or memory, whatever waited behind the stone would kill them before dawn. The oldest inhaled sharply, tore the top half of the papers and stuffed it into her bodice. The others understood instantly. Divide the evidence, divide the danger. They shoved the rest of the papers back into the wall, kicked the slab into place, and only when the stone sealed itself, the weightless footsteps faded. But not completely. They retreated into the wall, still listening, still watching. The ladies fled the room, candle dying again, hearts pounding, lungs twisted tight. Only when they reached the lit corridor did they stop. One whispered, "We have seen what should have died with them." The eldest replied, "No, what was meant to die in silence has awakened." None of them ever spoke of that night again. But from that night on, whenever they walked through the east corridor, each of them heard something faint, fabric dragging, soft steps, wind-shaped like women's voices, as if the betrayed queens were still trying to speak, and no one had yet dared to hear the rest. There are secrets that do not belong to a single person, a single reign, or a single written page. They belong to the cold stone walls where they were whispered for the first time, and in the Tudor court, across 6 lives crushed beneath the shadow of a king whose loneliness was greater than his power. Only one secret survived all 6 queens, a secret no one wrote down, no one dared speak aloud, yet one that flowed silently through the stones of Hampton Court, the stairwells of Whitehall, the dark crevices of the Tower of London. It traveled not through words, but through the terrified glances of ladies in waiting, the pages hidden beneath floorboards, the weightless footsteps in the rain-soaked nights, and the tears that slipped onto the silk collars of queens when no one dared touch the truth that was consuming them hour by hour. That truth was not about Anne Boleyn's alleged sins, not about Henry's obsession with a male heir, not about the twisted romances, nor the political schemes that placed Jane Grey on the throne only to behead her 9 days later. The final secret, the one that survived all 6 wives of Henry VIII, was a truth every Tudor woman would have been killed for saying. Not a single woman in the Tudor court died for her own sins. They died for Henry's. This secret began with Anne Boleyn, the only woman who dared look the king in the eye and see not power but fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of betrayal, fear of seeing himself reflected in the eyes of a woman smarter than he was. Anne's ladies heard her whisper at midnight, "I do not die for my faults. I die for his fear." Then came Jane Seymour, the only woman who gave Henry what he craved, a prince. But the ladies knew what no chronicle dared record. Jane did not die only from hemorrhage. She died because Henry needed to cleanse his own terror with the greatest price a woman could pay, her life. Jane did not die for her child. She died because Henry needed a symbol of purity to hide the crack spreading inside his rotting heart. Then came Anne of Cleves, the only woman who survived because she saw Henry's fear before he saw it himself. On their first night, when the candle went out for a heartbeat, Anne did not tremble. It was Henry whose hands shook. And in that instant, Anne understood the one truth that saves or kills every Tudor woman. It is not power that destroys women. It is the fear inside the man who holds the power. Catherine Howard died because Henry was obsessed with youth. The one thing that reminded him time was killing him faster than any enemy. When Catherine ran through the corridor screaming for mercy, her gown dragging across the floor. The ladies knew she was not dying for adultery. She was dying because Henry could not bear being reminded he was old, weak, and no longer the man he once was. Catherine died because of the shadow of Henry's aging that he refused to face. Catherine Parr, the final survivor, lived only because she understood this truth more deeply than anyone. She knew Henry did not kill women for being wrong. He killed them for being right at a moment when he could not bear the truth. Catherine wrote in the manuscript hidden beneath her floorboards, "No sin is more dangerous than speaking truth to a man afraid of the truth itself." But the secret did not end with the 6 wives. It continued in Mary, a woman haunted by the memory of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, who was cast aside not because she was wrong, but because Henry feared she would never yield. Mary did not die from illness. She died from a lifetime of carrying the agony, of being made illegitimate by her own father's terror. Elizabeth I carried that same secret all her life. Every time she heard the name Anne Boleyn, she felt Henry's shadow reminding her that her mother did not die for her mistakes, but for his. And the most brutal truth of all, Elizabeth, in her old age, during a moment of exhausted self-reflection, whispered, "We, every woman of this dynasty, never died for our sins. We died for his." That was the secret that survived 6 queens, survived Mary, survived Elizabeth, survived hundreds of ladies who witnessed what history dared not record. A secret that could never be written because if it were, the entire foundation of the Tudor dynasty would collapse into ash. That night, the night the ladies of Hampton Court heard the echoes of the dead queens, they did not just hear footsteps or fabric dragging or faint breaths. They heard the true whisper of history, a voice rising from the darkness, belonging to no one and everyone at once. A voice they all heard clearly. "None of us died for our own sins." The words snuffed out the candle, made the stone walls tremble, threw the palace into a silence heavier than death. And from that night on, the ladies understood one thing. Henry VIII had 6 wives, but the true cause of their deaths had only one name. Not doctrine, not treason, not adultery, not fate, but this: the fear of a man the entire kingdom was forced to kneel before. That was the final secret. The secret no one wrote, no one voiced, but one everyone felt when walking the corridors of Hampton Court on a rainy night. The secret that survived 6 queens, 2 crowned women, countless ladies in waiting, and the darkness itself. It is the one thing that never died. In every Tudor reign, beneath the grand portraits, beneath the gilded throne, and beneath the royal decrees signed with Henry VIII's iron hand, there existed another world. A world of women who were never allowed to tell the truth. And yet, they told it anyway. Not out loud, not openly, but through secret lines written at night, under the faint glow of a trembling candle, with hands shaking from the fear that a misplaced dot, a stray mark, could send them to the Tower of London before dawn. These diaries, thin pages hidden in shoes, under skirts, inside wall cracks, between layers of silk, were never meant to exist, and so the stories written within them became the forbidden diaries of the Tudor ladies. The things Tudor women dared to write only when they were sure no one could hear them breathe. People like to think ladies in waiting were shadows, silent figures who simply adjusted gowns, poured wine, lifted veils, but the truth is that they were the only eyes that ever witnessed what history refused to write down. And it was they, not the queens, who wrote these forbidden diaries, because they saw everything, heard everything, and feared everything. One of the earliest diaries, if one can call it that, belonged to a lady who served Catherine of Aragon. She wrote that every night, Catherine slept with a hand pressed to her chest, as if trying to keep her heart from breaking apart. "They say she is made of iron," the lady wrote, "but I have seen her cry, not for losing the king, but for losing her rightful place. The lady described the moment Catherine heard that Henry had announced Jane Seymour's pregnancy. Catherine smiled, a soft, polite smile. And then, once the door closed, she gripped the edge of the table so hard her hands bled. The diary reads, "I will never forget the sound of the wood groaning under her fingers. Everything in her life was taken without anyone asking. That diary was burned the very night Catherine lay dying. Her ladies gathered every page and fed them to the fire, because if anyone ever read it, the truth of Catherine's suffering would be used either to disgrace her or destroy them." Then came Anne Boleyn. No diary of hers survives, but one was retold through memory. A diary Anne did not write, but her ladies did, because they saw what Anne would never put into words. The night before her execution, she did not sleep. She walked back and forth, again and again, like someone running from her own shadow, but not Henry's shadow, not Cromwell's. Her own brilliance. Her brilliance saved her, then doomed her. One lady wrote that Anne whispered, "My only sin was believing they could bear the truth." That diary was not burned. It was wedged deep inside a wall in Anne's quarters, and 3 days later, guards found part of it gnawed by rats, while the rest had been taken by someone. No one ever knew where it went. In Jane Seymour's time, the forbidden diary was filled with another kind of fear. The king loves her, but Henry's love is a double-edged blade. Whoever is loved must die to prove their purity. A lady described Jane screaming in agony as Edward was born while Henry fell to his knees thanking God, never noticing the ashen face of the wife bleeding out behind him. The diary said, "I have never seen anyone die so utterly alone." Anne of Cleves left a forbidden diary unlike any other. No grief, no moaning, but sharp as steel. A lady serving her wrote, "My mistress knows what Henry fears. When he looks at her with disdain, she looks back with pity." One line was written, then violently crossed out. Too dangerous to exist, but still readable. Anne knows a secret Henry cannot face, that for the first time he has seen a woman who does not need him to live. That diary was burned the night Anne left court because she said, "Do not let Henry know I understood him too well." Catherine Howard left behind the most chilling forbidden diary, not written by her but by the lady who served her when she was only 15. She wrote, "I know about her in Dereham, I know about her in Culpeper, but if the king knows, they will not kill one, they will kill all." One entry described Catherine sobbing like a child when she heard she was arrested. She did not cry for her sin. She cried because the one thing she feared most had come. The past of a wounded girl was now the crime of a queen. That diary was buried beneath the floor of the tower room where Catherine screamed, "Henry, let me live!" No one ever dug it up. No one dared. Catherine Parr's forbidden diary was the most politically dangerous, filled with pages about her leanings toward reform, a belief that could have sent her to the stake. But another page held something far more fragile. "I heard Henry cry at night. Not loudly, not in grief. Only the sound of a pillow absorbing tears. I do not know if he wept from pain or because his soul had begun tearing itself apart." Parr's ladies hid her manuscript beneath the floorboards and swore never to reveal it. The terrifying thing was that years later, when they returned to her old chamber, the floor was empty. In Mary I's reign, the forbidden diary had only one surviving line. She did not die of illness. She died of a lifetime twisted into a shape she never wanted. And finally, Elizabeth I. Her ladies wrote that every time someone mentioned Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth stiffened, as if hearing metal scrape against her throat. One forbidden diary told, Elizabeth once dreamed of Anne standing in the corridor. She stood without a head, yet still looked at her daughter. Elizabeth cried and said, "I could not save you, but you must know, I lived." That diary was burned on the night Elizabeth forbade anyone in her court to speak of Anne Boleyn's death ever again, and all these forbidden diaries of Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, Mary, and Elizabeth, though burned, buried, hidden, torn apart, shared one thing. Every Tudor woman wrote the same truth, not about love, not about power, not about fear of death, but this: we were never allowed to be ourselves, and when a woman dares to be herself, the court will burn her before the sun can rise. It was the one thing they were never allowed to write, but they wrote it anyway. Then they burned it. But the ashes of those forbidden diaries, the ashes of silenced women, still linger in the cracks of Hampton Court, in the night wind of Whitehall, in the dark halls of the Tower of London, in the shelters of the homeless. The ashes of the President of the United States' death. But the scourge of the women in the cellar and the terror of the tunnel can yet be conquered in the night, and anyone who stands long enough in absolute silence will hear the whisper of those burned pages. We lived, we loved, we feared, but our truth no one ever extinguished. And when those forbidden diary pages had finally burned to ash, when the whispers of queens lived only in cold stone and shadowed corridors, we suddenly understand that history never truly ends. It only retreats, hiding in the silent spaces between lines, trapped inside the things women of that age were never allowed to say. Tonight, we have only opened the first door. There are still secrets without names, stories without acknowledgement, sighs from women whom history forced into silence. If you still hear their echoes, if you feel that thin line of cold traveling down your spine as though someone is standing just behind the veil of time, then perhaps those diaries never truly vanished. Perhaps they have simply been waiting for someone brave enough to turn the remaining pages. Only then will the darkness of the Tudor court step back. But for tonight, let it stay with you a little longer.